Hey everybody, welcome back to the Noel Casler podcast, episode 129. Coming to you from a rainy Hudson Valley. I know I say that every time, but it's raining every time. I hope you like rain. Broke out the rainy day guitar. Trusty McAllister. Anyway, hope everybody's doing well. Thank you for all the kind comments, as always. Sorry it's been a minute. I was out in California, actually, a few weeks ago. For a wedding. I went to a beautiful wedding. My cousin got married. And it was a lovely time. It was a lovely weather. Flew into LAX. It didn't seem like it was invaded, you know. It didn't seem like it was an occupied country that needed the Marines. One of my Marine cousins was actually at the wedding. He's out of the Marine Corps now, but he served in Afghanistan. And thinking about the fact that you're sending kids, you know, or 20-year-olds, 25-year-olds into L.A., people that signed up to be in the Marines are being deployed into Los Angeles. It's crazy. And if you followed me on Twitter or, you know, wherever you heard of me, if you saw me on a podcast or something in the last couple of years, the gist of my message is the deviant personality that is Donald Trump. His credo is basically like, F you, stop me, right? Who's going to make me not do that? That's how he operates. And nobody's stood up to him in a sufficient way, right? We haven't stopped him. He's president again, you know, and he's sending the military into American cities. And he's already got cops and National Guard guys there that are shooting at journalists with rubber bullets, which is just absolutely insane. And I'm sure you saw that video where the guy just lifted up the, you know, his little pellet gun thing, whatever you call it, and targeted that reporter like he clearly shot her. And that's nuts. It's nuts to think about that happening in 4 months, that's where we've ended up. And you got to think about what it's going to look like a year from now in the United States, right? Climate change alone, the weather and the rain, it's not just an inconvenience, right? It's on us now. It's going to affect every aspect of our lives and our economy and our strategic presence in the world. And we got a government that shut down all the science, right? NOAA, EPA, anything that's going to measure the effects of fossil fuels on our environment and sort of mitigate, you know, the disaster and give us ways to cope and deal with what's ahead for humanity, not just for us. And we used to lead the world in thought and research and science. And that's all being dismantled because Trump is pulling away from the world. He wants a kingdom that he can rule over, full of stupid people that will march lockstep with the wishes of MAGA, which is just basically a political ideology for dumbasses, for people who never matured beyond the kind of working class racism that was so endemic in the United States that nobody ever talked about, or we just kind of thought it was cute that you knew the local sheriff was a racist or the football coach. If you grew up in white suburban America, there's a lot of racism out there. People of color know this, right? And like white people don't necessarily always admit it. How many racist jokes you hear growing up in white America from teachers, from Boy Scout leaders. Like I grew up in the 70s and 80s. Like you talk about political correctness, there wasn't any. Like, and I don't just mean like in comedy and stuff. I just, the kind of things that were acceptable, like we have to evolve as a society is my point, right? You know, we grow. I'm not laying blame on everything. I'm trying to say, like, you don't want to regress, right? And you don't want a leader who forces regression and reactionary viewpoints on a people to manipulate them and gain power, because you're not only doing a grave disservice to those people that you're poisoning with your toxic dogma that'll end up having them living in a broken economy, usually going through a war before they get out of, get out from under the sway of the dictator. Hi, Germany, right? So you not only have that aspect of it, right? But it's just what it does to a society, to divide a people, to want them to go backwards in terms of human rights and how they look at their fellow Americans. It's inexcusable. You're not appealing to people to live and reach towards their better angels and be better people in the community, because the less racist people are the better people in the community. And part of what the dynamic of MAGA and Trumpism is these guys all think they're the good guys. Like, they don't know what we're talking about when we're mad at them for voting for Trump, because they're like, I'm a nice person in my community. I'm nice to the other parents of where my kid goes to school. I'm nice to my kids' friends. I'm polite at the supermarket. Like, I'm a decent white person living in the suburbs, and I just don't want to get attacked by immigrants, because they believe it. They watch Fox News. These are kind of simpletons. I've been to high school reunions and gotten in conversations with like suburban women that I knew, from high school, and they were like terrified of the city. They were like, I don't know how you live in the city, man. And one of them used the N-word in front of me, drunk. Like, it was so sad to see how unevolved people of my generation, and we're talking early 50s. But I was like, where have you been in 30 years? Have you not been anywhere? And the truth is, a lot of people don't go anywhere, which is okay. I'm not blaming them for that, but they stay in these sort of myopic little towns, and the right wing knew that. They knew that, like, what we think of as red state America and Southern attitudes could be superimposed upon the whole country. You could get them into NASCAR in upstate New York just as easily. And culturally, that's what they did, right? When you started seeing all the vets on the telephone poles in every town, and there's nothing wrong with honoring the vets, okay? But that was a very strategic campaign that was designed from a conservative viewpoint to align GOP MAGA politicians with the good guys, with the military, with the cops and the firemen. Same thing as the Blue Lives Matter flags, right? Same thing as all this iconography that I talk about from the right, the Screaming Eagle tattoos and all this MAGA kind of stuff. It's all for a purpose, to say, we're the authority, we're the patriots, we're the ones who love America, and these other people, these people you see in these still photos waving a Mexican flag in front of a smoke bomb or a Palestinian flag, in front of a burning car. These are the terrorists. These are the invaders. These are the scary people of color that are coming to, take away your way of life. And in a post 9/11 militarized suburban mindset, that stuff is very effective. And they don't think like, hey, 9/11, that was 19 Saudi Arabians, and the president now is doing a golf deal with Saudi Arabia, and Howard Lutnick is over there kissing as much ass as he could, even though he lost 658 employees on 9/11, and then cut off their benefits a couple weeks later, their paychecks, so their families, newly widowed, or without a dad or a mom, couldn't put food on the table. That's who Howard Lutnick is. He's happy to do business with the Saudi Arabians, And the United States government was like, we'll attack anybody but them, and they flew out the bin Ladens the very next day that were still here. So there was a lot more to that story that, like, Giuliani alone, not approving, like, the new radios for the fire department, putting the command center down near Ground Zero when the chiefs had told him to put it out in Brooklyn because an attack would obviously be around the World Trade Center. And that's what happened. But he wanted the photograph of him marching down there in the smoke and the dust, and that's what he got. And then he profited off it for 20 years and gave speeches and talked about how he was the hero of 9/11. He was anything but. And you now know who he was. And that was obvious to many people who lived in New York the whole time. Giuliani was a scumbag. He was not a hero of 9/11. Neither was Bernie Kerik, who just passed away, rest his soul. He went to jail for some of his actions after that. I won't get into all that now. My point is they don't question it, because the militarization of our cops and our sort of like first responders post 9/11 dovetailed perfectly with the psyche of the suburban white male and female, especially in my part of the country. Guys from Long Island, Jersey, Rockland County, Westchester, never forget, and the farther you go north and out, the more that attitude is sort of in the water. The dudes with the beards and the pickup trucks and all this kind of stuff. So it's so deep into the culture now that they won't question who the good guy is. That's why Trump knows that it's a popular play for him. Even though polling is saying it's not popular and people don't want the Marines in LA, he's banking on the fact that psychologically, as long as he keeps painting, who they're going after as the other, or as immigrants, somebody that it's easy for his base to be racist against. And it's obviously being driven by Stephen Miller and people that are racists. And Terry Moran just got suspended from ABC for calling him a hater, for saying the truth, speaking the truth. Because ABC's like, hey, we want to play ball with Trump. We got some Disney films to promote, So the media is going to be in on it too, on his little reality show, and that's what we're seeing. And they're making a lot of money off of the horse race, and they're probably pissed that the Elon, Trump little imbroglio from last week got pushed out of the news cycle so quickly, because they didn't want to ever do the work of investigating the ties with Epstein and all that stuff. And I'm not going to drag that back into your ears right now. If you've listened to this podcast before, you've heard me talk about it, And I have friends who were victimized by those two, by Trump in Epstein's house. So it's not a conspiracy theory. I heard Ari Melber apologizing. He wouldn't even read Elon's tweet, talking about the Epstein files with Trump, because he's like, it's such a smear, I won't even repeat it. What are you talking about? It's not a smear. They were friends. They flew all over the place together. They hung out in Mar-a-Lago. Everybody in the world's seen the video where Epstein is doubling over. And as I've said a million times, imagine being the guy who gets Epstein to double over in embarrassment. Dude, you took it there. That's too far, That's what happened. That's what's happening in this situation. And the media's not even taking the sort of breadcrumbs they've been offered in terms of here you go, follow this up. Now they got to do the reality show of Trump's, LA invasion. Anyway, pardon me, you get the idea. The media is going to do what's going to make it the most money. And of course, that's not everybody. I watched Rachel Maddow last night, and she's calling it like she sees it. This is an authoritarian takeover. Trump wants to be a dictator. That's obvious to everybody at this point. And we're living with the results of that. You have masked men roving the country, pulling people out of their cars, out of their classrooms, out of their kitchens, off of the yards that they're working their asses off, arresting them in front of Home Depot. That's how these protests started in L.A. Stephen Miller said, go target the Home Depot. I know that there's guys standing in front of the Home Depot because he's from Santa Monica, and that's how a lot of work gets done in California. Has the largest undocumented, population in the country. And that's not a negative thing. That's how the economy works. People are all interwoven there, as they are in most of America. Somebody's parent maybe wasn't documented but has been here for 30 years. They have kids that were born here. They're married to an American. They're an American. They're living here and working here. You're an American. Obviously you need some sort of organization with immigration, and it's a problem, but it's a government problem that you can apply bureaucratic solutions to and humane solutions and deal with it the right way, like a fucking first world country, not like a bunch of thugs sending your buddies from Pep Boys out to be militia members in the street, because that's what this is. I wrote about it in Noel's notes this week. You should check it out. It was a follow-up on a piece I wrote last year, which was I stayed in this hotel in Florida and people were training for something. There was a militia clearly training. They had all the tats, all the kind of iconography, the attitudes. They were giving me side eye constantly, so I'm running around in my hot pink shorts. You know, quite obviously a liberal type dude. But I could tell they were up to something, and they were off campus, sort of off site all day, and then they'd come back and do like training in the gym and around the pool and stuff. And somebody was footing the bill for this, and it wasn't cheap. This isn't a cheap hotel. This wasn't like the Ritz. They weren't on vacation. It was like a corporate hotel in an office park. It was the kind of place you send somebody for job training if they're, you know, if they're an investment banker and they're going to see a client, or, you know, it was a business thing. You know, they were there on some sort of like organized, well-funded effort, and I assumed that was happening all over the country. And I assumed at the time that it was, you know, Mike Flynn or Eric Prince or somebody, and it was in anticipation of unrest after the election that I was hoping Trump was going to lose, but he didn't lose, right? So there was no unrest. There was no need for, like, you know, an army of people to take to the streets. So I think those people have been absorbed into the ranks of the ICE agents. And that's a difficult thing to deal with, you know, because they're untrained. And you can look at their shoes and tell they're wearing soft-toed, you know, 2-year-old Skechers and stuff. Cops wear steel-toed shoes, especially if they're going to a situation where they anticipate some kind of public unrest. Right? So those guys showing up in San Diego, you know, they're wearing the night vision goggles and the helmets and the tactical vests, and then they're 30 pounds overweight and wearing like the Kohl's sweatshirt that their wife bought them. Like, it just doesn't add up. It doesn't, you know, it doesn't smell right. It smells fishy. It smells like a really untrained kind of hodgepodge of 1099 contractors. And I've been trying to investigate it a bit on the internet, and that's the sort of thing I come up with, that there's a big thing in the budget of like bonuses, and they're using this pile of cash, a slush fund, to sort of pay all these independent contractors. It'll come out, whatever they're doing. If they don't succeed, we'll get the facts on. But, you know, we have the reality of it now. We know something's up, something's not right. They're abusing their power. They're terrorizing people. That is the whole point. That's what Stephen Miller wants. That's what Trump wants. They want to stoke fear into the hearts of Americans and dominate them. And that's what their base is supporting, right? That's Trump's psychological tool, is he's making people who don't have that much look down on people who have even less and feel good about abusing them. And that's a dynamic that occurs in people who've been abused, right? Or who have been brutalized in a way. They sort of like, it's like in prisons or something, they get off on watching some other guy get his ass kicked, you know? There's like, when people are hurt, you know, they want to hurt other people and lash out at them. And Trump is picking on communities that have been kind of decimated by the same conservative philosophies they're still buying. And that's what's so scary about this time, because it's sort of so well engineered and so well funded, you know, that Rupert Murdoch could step in and see that basically 30, 40 years ago, that the kind of NASCAR, NFL, rural red state America was a gold mine for cash, and they weren't that politically sophisticated if you waved a flag at them, you know, and you sort of hearkened at them, you know. You paid homage to the myth of what an American was, this rugged individualist and just a lone guy on his tractor going up and down the field in Kansas, and it's morning again in America, you know. And the reality of that whole situation is like all of the agriculture was like these big, huge corporate monoliths that were using genetic engineering, and like, you know, we were paying people not to grow crops, and it was all this anything but like a lone American family farmer out there striving and, you know, scraping it together for some seed money and putting an honest product on the table. That's not what it was. Like, agriculture, petrochemical industry has their hands in all that stuff too. You know, Koch brothers, ConAgra, ExxonMobil, Giant corporations, right? And the people who make money off of doing business with them on Wall Street decided what the future of these Americans was going to look like. And they're getting a taste of what it is now, what the reality being served to them by the people who really own the people that they're voting for. It's hitting them now. But it's also hitting them at a time where they do have this sort of charismatic leader who has a cult-like hold over them because he's willing to keep the culture war going. He's willing to be a reality show and be exciting to them. If you're an idiot and you don't understand the consequences of all this, it probably seems pretty entertaining. It might seem cute to you when he ambushes world leaders in the Oval Office and has his boys all sitting there on the couch cackling like a bunch of frat bros. That might make you feel good about being an American in the moment, but that makes you a dumbass. Because if you don't respect your allies and your neighbors, you're not a strong person. You're not an upstanding citizen in the world. You're not a leader, right? Leaders have compassion and intelligence and respect for their neighbors, big and small. They don't talk about dominating them or invading them or belittling them in their contributions. That's what little men do. That's what bullies do. And that's what Trump is. He's a bully. He's a guy with the biggest inferiority complex you could imagine, masquerading as a tough guy. And he makes other fake tough guys feel tough, feel virile. He's anything but. He's a wrinkly, saggy, bag of pus stumbling through life in a stupor of Adderall and benzos, thinking about how hot his daughter used to look when she was a teenager. That's who he is. He's a broken man. He's a scumbag. And he's in charge of the world's largest economy and the world's largest military. And they've both basically been plunged into chaos in 4 months. What does it look like in 4 years? What are the ramifications of what we're doing now, pulling out of USAID, letting hundreds of thousands of people die, millions when it's all said and done? There's been 300,000 so far, mostly children that have died. That's in 4 months. What happens when our soft diplomacy, which spread all around the globe and served our interests, not just in terms of capitalism and exploiting our neighbors, but protecting democracy, protecting our way of life, making the world a safe place to travel, making an exchange of ideas and education and students going back and forth. That's all a good thing. We've pulled away from all that. He's attacking higher education. He's telling, foreign students they're not welcome here. You don't want the genius from China coming to study at Harvard? Yeah, you do. You want the best and the brightest. That's an American export. They come and they get educated in America. They get American ideas and values and intellectualism and research and the benefits of being so vast and wealthy. And then they take it back to where they come from. And if you believe in America, your ideals, the DNA of what makes this country great is now shared around the world, in hospitals and universities. Right? So we're turning our back on all of that, all of the good stuff, to be insular, to pull back and say, no, we don't need doctors, we need plumbers. That's the literal message that MAGA's given their people, because they think they're idiots. They don't respect them. Most people don't want their kid to grow up and be a plumber. Not that there's any shame in being a plumber, and obviously it's a skilled trade and you make a lot of money. I'm just using it as an example, right? But the whole American thing was like, I'm going to work really hard with my hands or in a factory or something, and then maybe you get to be a lawyer or a doctor, or an actor or whatever you want to be, Start your own business, be a plumber, be a carpenter, work with your hands. There's brilliant things to do as tradesmen. There's room for everybody. My point is you don't limit the options, and that's what they're doing, because they're saying these careers are suitable for MAGA types, right? A construction worker, like auto mechanic, right? But woke lawyer, human rights advocate, doctor, scientist, immunologist, somebody who develops vaccines. Kennedy just fired the whole board for the CDC. The immunization vaccine board, the kind of people you want in place when you have another strain of COVID swirling around, which you have right now. There's another pandemic out there waiting to bear down on you, and you won't even hear about it this time because they dismantled all of the safeguards and science that saved our ass just 4 years ago. 5 years ago now, when Trump was in charge and 1 million Americans died. Like, how crazy are we as a nation that we're even back here? We're not only putting Trump back in charge, which we have, we let him put RFK Jr. in charge of HHS, a guy who doesn't believe in science, a whack job, a lunatic. 5 years after a nation lost 1 million people. I had friends who died. They went into the hospital, you never saw them again. Happened all over the place. It's insane. And that's what Trump does. He breaks things. You bring him in if you want to destroy a society. And look how effective he is. Putin's going to get everything he wanted. He plays Trump like a fiddle. He's destabilizing the West. He's going to get to invade somebody else. If he doesn't get beaten in Ukraine, we're pulling back our support. He's going to invade Poland if we're not careful. And we got morons in charge. You want a drunk Secretary of Defense answering the phone when we get that call? So it's serious, obviously, and I'm not trying to bum you out. I'm not trying to give a litany of all the fear. It's just we're in some very serious times. I think a lot of people are in denial still, because if you have a relative amount of comfort, you're like, yeah, it's changed, but how much has it really changed? And I think that's going to dawn on people in the weeks ahead, with what comes of LA and whatever. So, I'm going to get off here in a minute. I just wanted to reach out to you guys and say I missed you, and I hope all is well and everybody's hanging in there, and I'll try to do these a little more frequently. I do them when I can, but kind of got a lot going on these days like everybody else, and writing about it is the clearest way to put my thoughts, because I feel like I'm repeating myself all the time on the podcast. And just be good, That's a good way to fight back, is just to enjoy your life as much as you can, Don't tune out. Because we got to think of what's at stake, You're ripping mothers away from their kids and stuff. That's not America. That's not democracy. That's not any kind of country we want to live in, man. You don't deny a child the ability to kiss their parent goodnight, man. Some things you don't mess with. What's the point if you're messing with that kind of stuff? You know what I mean? What are you protecting if you're trying to take that away from somebody else? You're not protecting anything. Emptiness, hatred, bigotry, the cold heart. Those aren't the things you fight for in life, You fight for other people. You show up, You show up for the innocent. You show up for the abused. You lend a hand to somebody who needs it, You give them a helping hand. You got a friend for life, You don't treat them as the other. Immigrants aren't the other either. They're every bit a part of this country as the rest of us. We're all immigrants here. That's obvious. Anyway, thanks for listening. Episode 129, Noel Casler podcast. I'll come back and hang out with you guys soon. Sign up for Noel's Notes if you want. Take it easy. Peace.